And I think, as always, in times of genocide, of war, of destruction of entire peoples and societies, the ability to come together to try to make sense of the world and to think collectively about how to try to change it is extraordinarily important. And so I'd like to thank the comrades from the IS for organizing this and making it possible for all of us to come together. So, like you heard, I was asked to talk about the relationship between Israel and the United States and to reflect on the nature of that relationship. And I think it's very relevant and has been a growing point of discussion, I think, in the context of the genocide in Palestine and the kind of expansionist wars led by Israel and the United States across the region, and particularly in Lebanon and Iran. And in that context, I don't know if surprisingly, I was going to say surprisingly, I don't know if it's surprising. Maybe it makes sense because it's brought to the center of political debate. The nature of the relationship between Israel and the United States has come under growing discussion, and I think often from the political right. So we have these new figures that have discovered a sudden interest in the Palestinian question, chief amongst them people like Tucker Carlson, who have become extremely popular, I think for the worst, and we can talk about that, inside of the Palestine movement, and who have put forward an idea that I think is becoming more and more popular, which is this idea that Israel is occupying us, right? Our politics are occupied by Israel. Our kind of national politics are unnaturally being transformed by the influence of the lobby and the kind of support of our governments for Israel is against our national interest, and we might want to think about what a national interest is, or if such a concept exists, and one which sort of unnaturally distorts foreign policy in the West. And even amongst left-wing platforms, the debate has kind of been opened, perhaps not quite to that extent, but on whether the relationship between the United States and Israel, as being that of Israel being the watchdog or the military base of the United States in the region, is no longer a useful way to understand that relationship, and so that Israel is actually forcing the United States or its Western allies into a whole number of actions that are destructive or not in their interest. And so certainly now the war in Iran and the absolute catastrophe that it is proving to be for American imperialism in the region, and however it's dressed up, what will undoubtedly be a burning defeat of the United States in the region is sort of being used as the example of, look, the United States were forced into something that was actually against their interest. Now, I want to argue the opposite. I want to say that it is very much still the case that Israel is the attack dog of the United States in the region, that it is the representative of Western power in the region, and that it is actually politically crucial for us to understand it that way. Because maybe you might think, well, why does it matter? Is it that important? I actually think it leads to very different political consequences how you settle that question. And I'll come to that at the end. But so I'm going to try to do three things. One is to sort of set out the scene of how Zionism was understood by its original imperial backers, Britain, at the establishment of the Zionist project in Palestine. I'll then think about the relationship between Zionism and the Israeli state and the United States, and think about different ways in which that relationship can be understood. And then I'll end with the contemporary period and what is to be done. I'm going to struggle for time, so I'll do my best, but apologies in advance. So, I'm also going to do this a lot because I lose the ability to generate saliva in public speaking, so apologies in advance. And it kind of creates horrible sounds in microphones. Anyway, moving on swiftly. So, why Palestine? And I think that really is the central question. I think all of this can seem strange if we think of Palestine in isolation, why would anybody care so much about this small piece of land somewhere in the Middle East if it wasn't because our governments were being controlled by external influences that had designs on that land? And I think one of the problems we have is that Palestine tends to be understood, sometimes even in our movement, in isolation from the rest of the region within which it exists. We tend to think of Palestine as a kind of I guess what academics call in methodologically nationalist terms, right? That it sort of stops at its borders that of course are imposed by imperialism itself. So Palestine lies at a key area of the world economy. It's a key nodal point in the world economy. It's at the crossroads of historic international trade routes between Africa, Asia and Europe. It is on the eastern side of the Suez Canal, which was and remains the most important maritime thoroughfare, trade thoroughfare in the world. And it is at the gates of a region that is filled with some of the most important strategic goods that make a global capitalist economy tick. Most importantly, oil, gas, and a whole number of other derivatives from those extractive processes. Fertilizers being the most striking one. And of course, we've had quite an important reminder of how important that region is for the world economy, given the extraordinary power that the Iranian regime was able to mobilize by shutting the Strait of Hormuz and bringing into question the circulation of oil, gas, and fertilizers, and the consequences that's going to have for the world economy for a very long time. And it is because of that, and only because of that, that Palestine is important. As a small aside, it's been important for that reason, for a very, I should say, for imperial powers. It's that for that reason and only because of that it's important for imperial powers. You can edit out the first version in the video. So, and it's interesting actually that some of that goes back a very long time. So if you look at the discussions, for example, of Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, who conquered or liberated Palestine from the Crusaders, already at the time he discusses, him and the people around him discuss Palestine in these terms. They talk about Palestine being at the center of the trade routes between Africa, Asia, and Europe. They talk about that to control the region, they must control Egypt and Palestine in order to be able to control the connection between the continents. This is a very long-running kind of strategic point. And of course, that's why there were crusades to begin with. Nobody cared about, bad news if you like the history you've been taught at school, nobody cared about Jerusalem or the Christians there. In fact, they kept killing all the Christians there when they arrived because they looked a little bit too much like the locals. The question was who would control the trade routes, right? So this is a very long-running question. The Zionists were very clear about this. So Herzl, Theodor Herzl, the kind of intellectual father of Zionism, writes in 1890, should have written down the year, 1896, I think, in the Jewish State, the kind of where he theorizes the idea of political Zionism. He writes that we, so the Zionist movement, should there, Palestine, form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, i.e. neutral towards European powers, remain in contact with all of Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence, right? So you already have that relationship that he understood that if the colonial project would work in Palestine, Zionism would have to represent European powers in this kind of crucial place in the world economy. Even more strikingly, Max Nardau, a central figure in the early Zionist movement in Europe, identified these same considerations when he told a meeting in London in 1919 that was attended by the Prime Minister at the time, Lloyd George, that we, so the Zionists, shall have to be the guards of the Suez Canal. We shall have to be the sentinels of your way to India via the Near East, right? So it was about the Suez Canal and the trade routes with India and Asia in general, something you should bear in mind for when I get to the contemporary period. The British were just as clear-eyed about why they were supporting the Zionist movement. So famously, Sir Ronald Storrs, who was the first British military governor of Palestine, explained British support for Zionism as the development of a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism, right? A little loyal Jewish Ulster, Ulster being the British settlement in the north of Ireland, where British loyalists are rioting against migrants as we speak. And so making the kind of the colonial relation clear, saying that's what we are going to do in Palestine by building a loyal little Jewish Ulster in order to fight potentially hostile Arabism. So understanding that this strategic area needed to be held against the wishes of the local population. Leo Amory, similarly in 1918, explained that strategically Palestine and Egypt go together because Palestine is a necessary buffer to the Suez Canal, as well as geographically, practically at the center of the British Empire. Decades later, in the 1970s, the US Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, famously explained that Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk, does not carry even one American soldier, and is located in a critical region for American national security. And I mean, there's so many of those. At some point I had to stop writing down quotations, but that of course continues into the present. You might remember that Biden explained if there was not an Israel, we'd have to invent one, or the German Chancellor Merz in the summer of 2025, when Israel first attacked Iran, explained that Israel's attack on Iran was, and I quote, "dirty work Israel is doing for all of us." So over and over and over again, Western powers are extremely clear about two things. This region is absolutely key for the circulation of capital on a global scale. And the point of Zionism is that it is an outsourcing of military policing of that region for continuous military base. And so people say, well, what about all the Arab regimes that the US also sells weapons to? The difference is that here you have a settler population that understands the wages of empire, is that their colonial project is protected, supported, armed, financed, as long as they do the dirty work for all of us in terms of controlling and imposing imperial will in the region. Now, sorry, that was the Brits. So what about the United States? We tend to read history backwards. So we assume that, okay, that's not good. We assume that history, that the relations as we understand them today were always the same. And in fact, the United States was fairly unsure about the Israeli project early on. It supported the creation of Israel, but with hesitations, because the Soviet Union also supported the creation of Israel, something that our tanky friends like to forget. In fact, they armed the Zionist militias. The weapons came from Yugoslavia. Because of this question of where the Israeli state would land in the Cold War, much as the question of where the Arab nationalist states would land, the Americans supported Zionism as well as the Arab states, as did the Soviets, and for a while the relation isn't clear. In fact, it leads to direct confrontations in 1956, when the Israelis, alongside the British and the French, try to lay hold over the Suez Canal. Again, the centrality of the Suez Canal and the mobilization of Israel to try to control it. The United States and the Soviet Union step in to sort of discipline much more the French and the British by telling them, you're no longer calling the shots, we are the new bosses in town. But after that, after 1956, Ben-Gurion, who's the Prime Minister of Israel, theorizes that Israel can never enter a military confrontation again without previous agreement with the United States, because they can't be humiliated in the way they were forced to pull out, to give back the Sinai to Egypt and Gaza, in fact, and to return. That relationship really flourishes in the mid-1960s, when the entry of Arab nationalism into sphere of influence of the Soviet Union is very clear, and the United States decide to use Israel to crush Arab nationalism, which they do in a series of wars, and most importantly in 1967 and 73. And famously, Henry Kissinger, also known as the spawn of the devil, explains in 1973, the United States saved Israel from collapse at the end of the first week of the conflict in 1973 by our arms supply. What we wanted was the most massive Arab defeat possible so that it would be clear to the Arabs that they would get nowhere with dependence on the Soviets. We sought to break up the Arab United Front. And that's, of course, what they did. After defeat of the Egyptian army and the Syrian army in 1973, Egypt enters into a peace accord with Israel, which is really a peace accord. It's a signing of its defeat of the empire and the entrance through this economic and political accord with Israel into the American sphere of influence. At that moment, the relationship between the US and Israel changes from being simply a military one. Israel is a military base that has to crush the enemies of the United States in this central region, and Israel is increasingly going to be used as a representative of American power in the region. So through normalizing the relationship between Israel and different regimes in the region, American influence in the region will be normalized. And so you see over and over again that particular agreements are made between Israel and different states, or between the United States and different states, in which the normalization of Israel and its economic presence in the region is made central. And so really to kind of enter relations with Israel in this period is to take the knee in front of the New World Order, a relationship that's going to accelerate rapidly in the 1990s. And it's going to accelerate primarily on two axes. On the one hand, the Oslo Accords. I don't have time, but you can ask me questions. The Oslo Accords are going to do nothing for a Palestinian state, but what they will do is that they're going to allow Israel and the United States to say to the other regimes in the region, look, the Palestinians are prepared to deal with us, so why wouldn't you? An opportunity that the ruling classes of the region were happy to take with both hands, no longer hamstrung by public or popular pressure forcing them to support, or at least to pay lip service to support for the Palestinians. And so you get a whole number of agreements, most importantly the peace agreement with Jordan in 1994 and the economic agreements that come with that. The second part of that, and the peace agreements with both Egypt and Jordan come with big industrial investment as well. You get the establishment of qualified industrial zones in which Jordanian and Egyptian companies get the right of exporting without taxation to the United States, on the condition that they use a certain percentage of input industry from Israel. So it's a direct tying of those regimes' economies to the Israeli economy in order to tie them to American power. Again, I don't have time. If you have questions about the qualified industrial zones, you can ask me. The second axis are the MENA summits, which is the United States' attempt, in the context of the collapsing of the Soviet Union, of generating a free exchange area in the Middle East, in which they're trying to sign individual free trade agreements with different countries in the region. And their plan is to sort of cobble them together in one zone. It fails for a whole number of reasons. Again, I don't have the time, you can ask me questions about it. But what's important about the MENA summit is that every single agreement that the United States signs with countries in the region includes a recognition of Israel clause. So again, recognizing Israel, normalizing relations is made a key aspect of entering the sphere of influence of the United States. And this is really understood by the masses of the region, by the way. When you have the uprisings in 2011 and in 2019, all the revolutionary movements in the region make the connection between bringing their own ruling classes down and solidarity with the Palestinians, because they understand that the two are intimately linked with one another. And so while they're bringing down their dictators, they're also kicking out the Israeli ambassador. They're blowing up the pipelines that are sending cheap gas to Israel. They are demanding the end of the peace deal, something that still continues, particularly in Jordan, in the context of the genocide. Okay, so the current period. In the current period, that relationship shifted slightly again. And it starts really under the Obama administration. I assume that at Marxism, nobody has any illusions in Obama. If you do, you can ask a question about it in the Q&A, and I'm sure we can collectively sort of make a list. But Obama is the first American president who theorizes the need to shift American attention fully on China. And he calls it the tilt to the Pacific, hand in hand with Hillary Clinton, who never met a war she didn't love, including, in fact, Trump's recent assault on Iran. She's now changed her tune, but there's this great interview early on where she says, she's very surprised, but Trump really has the courage to go and bomb more brown people than she did, which she was certainly envious about. In the Clinton and Obama administration, the idea of the tilt to the Pacific goes through an attempt at increasing the independence of America's allies in the region. The idea is that the allies need to do the work themselves, certainly Israel, but also the Gulf states, and so that America can focus its attention on China. And out of that will come, after the Obama administration, two important examples of that. On the one hand, the so-called Abraham Accords, peace deals with countries that Israel was not at war with, so you can't really understand them as peace deals. They are agreements between between allies that reinforce economic and military relations at a time where the United States is trying to pull out of the region and leaving its allies to do the job for it. The second one is the so-called I2U2, so it's Israel, India, UAE, and US, and it's the attempt at building an alternative corridor to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So the idea is that from India through the UAE, through Israel, and then through Europe and the United States, will open up a corridor that brings agricultural output from India towards the West and technological, military. They always talk about the desalination technology. You won't be surprised to discover that desalination is not the main concern of the Modi regime in terms of what they can get from the Israelis. But what's important again about this is this idea of creating, is this ability about creating alternative trade infrastructure, again, highlighting the centrality of the region. And by the way, the question of Saudi Arabia here is really important, because the question of whether they would be able to get Saudi Arabia to officially enter the normalization agreements, and I say officially because Saudi has lots of relations with Israel, including during the genocide, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you're interested. But the hope, and there's lots of videos about this online, was to create on-land routes that would connect the UAE via Saudi Arabia through Jordan and into Israel, that would create alternative trade routes that avoided both Bab el-Mandab and the Hormuz Strait. So very relevant now. And in fact, if you listen to Netanyahu, he cannot stop reminding everybody that there is an alternative and we could build these roads, etc. But the real question is whether the Saudi Arabian regime is prepared to risk its international standing. But what's important here is that the strategy from the kind of 2010s onwards is not abandoning the special relationship, but is to give greater powers to Israel alongside the Gulf states to manage the infrastructure of empire in this kind of crucial area in the world economy. And of course, that's what gets challenged on the 7th of October, which I'll come to in 1 second. But I just want to point out two things in terms of in what direction does that relationship go, that I think gets forgotten in this debate, and that I think in a sense sort of settle it. One is in what direction does money flow? Money flows from the center of the empire, from the United States to Israel. I think the numbers sort of speak for themselves. It's $300 billion since 1948 at 2024 adjusted levels for inflation, and 3.8 billion a year before the genocide. The agreement that Israel can maintain a qualitative edge, so the idea that Israel can buy better weapons than any other state around the world, and in fact that Israel is the only state that has the right to both receive money from the United States, which it invests in its own military industry, and has the right to privatize technology that it buys from the United States for its own high-tech industry. So if you ever hear Israeli officials talk about the high-tech miracle in Israel, there is no miracle. Israel has the right to have its officers use American technology in the IDF, leave the IDF, and use that technology to start up new high-tech companies based on that technology. So it's a direct pipeline from Washington to the so-called creation of technology in Israel. Since the beginning of the genocide, that help has of course blown up. 21 0.7 billion is the closest estimate by September 2025 of direct and indirect military aid to Israel, to which you can add the 10 billion that the United States has spent on bombing Yemen, and the over 100 billion on bombing Iran. So that's the first thing that I think is important to sort of bear in mind at the back of our heads, is that in terms of how the relationship works, the United States can close the tap at any time in terms of disciplining its ally. And in fact, the United States has not been afraid of doing so at different moments in time. So in 1956, the Suez Crisis that I already talked about, Eisenhower at the time threatened direct economic sanctions on Israel if it didn't pull out of Suez and the Sinai. Israel pulled out of Suez and the Sinai. In 1983, after the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which, by the way, was recognized in the UN as an act of genocide, something we tend to forget today, Ronald Reagan stopped F-16 deliveries to Israel until Israel pulled out of Beirut and moved to the south of the country. So again, the United States was able to mobilize its leverage in order to discipline Israel. And again in 1991, when Yitzhak Shamir was unwilling to sign or enter the process of the Oslo Accords under pressure of George Bush Sr., George Bush withheld $1 billion American in economic aid, which he greenlit after the election of Rabin and his entry of negotiations with the PLO leadership. And so over and over again, that money flow is mobilized by the United States to discipline Israel, and I think that sort of clarifies the nature of the relationship that I've been talking about. So very briefly, because I haven't heard from the chair in a moment, but I think I'm not doing well for time. What about the current crisis? 3 minutes, that's better than I thought. I think you're lying, but I'm very grateful, so thank you. So the current crisis. In that context, I think I'll say very briefly, and we can talk about it more because I assume, people know about this more. Two things are important. One, what happened on the 7th of October. On the 7th of October, Hamas put a major question mark, and the rest of the resistance in Gaza put a major question mark on that entire infrastructure of normalization that I've been talking about. It put the Palestinian question back at the center of the political question in the Middle East, and it forced every single regime in the region that was happily normalizing with Israel to have to respond to their populations and find themselves under international scrutiny. Often forgotten episode is that I think 10 days before the 7th of October, it's the end of September 2023, Netanyahu is in the United States doing one of his kind of embarrassing pop-up presentations where he holds up a map of what he calls the New Middle East. And the New Middle East has Palestine disappeared on it and includes the whole of Saudi Arabia and all the normalizing kind of countries. And so very much on everybody's lips is the idea that the Saudis are about to join the normalization, and that kind of infrastructure of a more autonomous infrastructure of empire in the region run by the Gulf powers and the Israelis is about to be realized. That enters into fundamental crisis on the 7th of October. And I think there's a big question mark on whether it can recover from it. Not because normalization hasn't continued. Trade has actually ballooned between the Gulf states, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel during the genocide. There's very good indications to show that Saudi Arabia has allowed trade to go over its national territory with the closing of Bab el-Mandeb by the Houthis. But whether the Saudis can sell both to their population and to their kind of standing in the Muslim world the idea that they're going to enter this new kind of setup, I think there's a real question mark. The other one is that it's forced the United States back into a region that it was trying to pull itself out of in order to be able to focus on China. And so the kind of necessity to destroy both the political forces that challenge that project, but also to kind of create a lesson for all those who would oppose the empire, I think is central in the genocide. I don't think the genocide is irrational at all. I think genocides is how empires have historically projected their power. You can't find an empire over the last 500 years that hasn't ruled by mass murder, genocide, mass displacement, destruction, etc. I don't need to explain anybody in the Netherlands what that looks like. But so I think the desire to grasp towards irrationality to explain it undermines both the cruelty and the horrors of what capitalism looks like, and doesn't allow us to understand what is going on, which is that it's absolutely in the United States' interest, particularly in a situation of crisis of its own hegemony and increasing reliance on brute force to expand its power, to act in this way. And then I'll end on the question of the war on Iran. Is the war on Iran an aberration? Where the United States tricked into it, etc.? Two things I would say. The first is that at a very large bird's eye view, there is a logic to this war. What is the logic of the Trump administration? It is the expression of absolute brute force in order to control key nodal points of the world economy, in order to try to push the Chinese back into their box. Panama, Greenland, Strait of Hormuz, right? So that's the kind of the broad picture. There is also very long-term desire in the American ruling class to crush the Islamic Republic of Iran, that runs through all of the presidencies, starts in 1979, and is a shared kind of desire between the ruling classes in the United States and Europe, Israel, and the Gulf countries. In fact, the rapprochement between the Gulf countries and Israel is entirely based on that is partly based on that in the 1970s. And so I think that in the context of the genocide, the United States and its allies see an opportunity first to box Iran in. And so you get the attacks after Gaza, on Lebanon, on Yemen to a lesser extent, and on Iraq. And quite actually an effective attempt at boxing in Iran in that context. And then I think there is a moment of overreach. The idea that everything has gone so swimmingly. You get the moment in Venezuela, a very effective kind of regime change. Nobody is going to stop us. We're good to go. And there is a moment of overreach. And I'll just end with that, is that there is a tendency to want to explain the moment of overreach as having to come from outside. And I think that's a real danger, because I think it betrays our idea that empires are infallible. That if the empire makes a mistake, if the powerful make a mistake, it's because they were tricked into it by an outside force that doesn't have their best interest at hand. Luckily, we know that the powerful make mistakes all the time. If they didn't, we'd still be living under whatever empire was the first one. We'd all still be Roman citizens or whatever, right? Like, empires make mistakes. They overreach. They miscalculate. They get defeated over and over and over again. And so I think we're in a moment of imperial overreach that will have consequences. And what those consequences will look like, I think, remains to be seen. In the last sentence before the chair Rugby tackles me to the floor, I'll just say this. I think to read the situation and the relationship between the United States, or the West more generally, and Israel in this way is important. Because if you think Israel is occupying us and is unnaturally undoing our national interest, I think it leads to very dangerous alliances. It leads to the idea that you have to save the nation from external control, alliances with lots of parts of the ruling classes, of the far right, etc., that think that the nation or our nations are these kind of positive, progressive entities that, if it wasn't for the evil Zionists, would do wonderful things in the world. And I think that as revolutionaries, we know that that's not the case. That actually the enemy is, of course, the people eliminating Palestinians and Lebanese and Iranian populations in the region now and for a very long time, but the enemy is at home. The money, the bombs, the diplomatic support flows from here, and we know it, we see it on our activism, and we understand that that is the struggle. The struggle is to free Palestine, but it is to free ourselves as well, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.